We're going to go through what the outcome was in those situations when price controls were implemented against market forces. The three governments that we're going to go through: 1, the Soviet Union; 2, Venezuela; 3, the United States. We are going to kick off this video with a quote, an analogy from Milton Friedman describing price controls. If you want to analyze wage and price controls, the simplest analogy that brings it home is to think of a kettle on your stove in which there is water and the water is boiling, and the boiling water is threatening to throw the cover off. The sensible thing to do is to turn the heat down under the kettle. Another thing you can do is take a brick and put it on the top of the kettle. We have 5 definitions that we're going to cover here, and we're going to use them throughout the video. First one is price ceilings. This is the maximum price set for a good or service imposed by a governing body. This is the highest price that you're allowed to pay for a certain good or service. Price floor, the opposite here, a minimum price set for a good or service imposed by a governing body. This is the lowest price that you can pay for a good or service. Shortages. This is when the demand for a good or service exceeds its supply in a marketplace. This is when you go to the supermarket and they do not have what you're looking for. You're going for cucumbers, you're going for tomatoes. There's a shortage on those. They're not going to be at the grocery store. That's an example of a shortage. Surplus. This is going to be the opposite of a shortage. You're going to the grocery store. You want those cucumbers. You want those tomatoes. There's an abundance of them. There's a surplus amount of tomatoes. This is where the supply for a good or service exceeds its demand in a marketplace. Barter. This is when you're exchanging goods and services without having a medium like money in between. This is when your neighbor has cucumbers. You have tomatoes. You want cucumbers. Your neighbor wants tomatoes. You're going to barter with that system and exchange those two so you both can have a salad. That's going to be a barter system. All right, our first historical example is going to be the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union implemented a planned economic structure called material balance planning. This was a totally planned economy where the inputs and outputs are completely balanced. In theory, you significantly reduced any waste in the economy, and the government would plan and allocate appropriate resources to provide services, goods, jobs, and wages for the entire population. This on paper looked very viable. This looks like hey, you could balance out your budget between the inputs and the outputs, and then you would just run this efficient economy. The agency in charge of the entire economy was called the Ghost Plan. The Ghost Plan was the central planning agency that set production levels along with prices. They would also determine the jobs needed for the production quotas and how much jobs paid in wages. Through material balance planning, could balance both sides of the equation. The outputs would equal the inputs. The budgeting, the forecasting were so crucial to Ghost Plan's efforts. Production goals were set by specific locations, and the planning would flow down based upon forecasts and budgets. To finance Ghost Plan's budget was Ghost Bank. Ghost Bank was created as the central bank of the Soviet Union. Ghost Bank was also the bank for all individuals of the Soviet Union. Wages and payments were handled through Ghost Bank, where it could be fully tracked and traced by the government. Basically anything, whether what you got paid, you're submitting an invoice, no matter what financial transaction happened in the Soviet Union, it went through Ghost Bank. And they were able to fully track all transactions through Ghost Bank. As we mentioned with Ghost Plan, they set production, they set pricing, they set wages. There effectively was no market price. There was no supply and demand being factored into this economy. It was fully planned out. The effects of supply and demand had no impact to prices. Wages experienced the same effect as well. With no market prices to judge supply and demand, the value of a job and subsequent wages were not based on the demands of that job. It was at the decision-making, forecast, and budgets of Ghost Plan. They determined what those jobs paid, so if they valued that job more than likely the wages would be higher for that job. This meant that money was an expression of labor, and it also meant the value of a good could not be rationally priced. You just could not look at the price of something in the store and rationally be like, okay, that's what it's worth, because there's no supply and demand forces. There's no market forces upon that price. It was set by the Ghost Plan, and that is the price that they determined. Ghost Plan production budgets and forecasts, as you can imagine, complicated. Ghost Plan would plan for more than 20,000 items, and since there wasn't a profit motive, it was really challenging to judge company efficiency. How efficient were these companies? What was the return on investment? It was totally planned out. You don't know if you're being efficient. You don't know if the return on investment was good. You have no idea. And how do you allocate capital? What items are going to be high in demand and what items are not going to be high in demand? You kind of have to say, okay, where am I going to be allocate resources? Where am I going to allocate capital? Knowing that I'm going to have a high demand for this particular good or service. It's really hard to judge in this type of planning. So what happened? The Soviet Union during this economic effort would experience shortages and surpluses. They would face those extremes very often because it was next to impossible to forecast demand and budget for such a large population. This led to food and medical shortages. The economy was not efficient without properly forecasting the demand for the year. And that's almost impossible to figure out on a year-by-year basis. And when you don't get the forecast and budgets correct, you end up with surplus goods and services in certain areas, and you end up with shortages in other areas. And unfortunately, a lot of the shortages ended up being with food and medicine. Bartering was common in this economy. People would barter for goods and services, but even that was challenging to figure out the value for one good or another. Ghost Plan's planning was impossible. How do you forecast 20,000 items and price them and give them production quotas each year? It's impossible to plan for that. And the value was also impossible to judge. With no market prices of goods and services, you did not know what a price represented. Without having a market, it did not necessarily represent a good or service that people wanted. Was it a good that was in demand? Was it a good that was not in demand? Well, that was up to the Ghost Plan if it was something they deemed would be in demand and would set production quotas for. If you got any value out of this video so far, please go ahead, smash that like button. And if this is something that you're interested in, please consider subscribing. All right, let's go into Venezuela. Venezuela, this was an economy solely based around oil. Venezuela's economy is based on the oil industry. It subsidizes its economy based on oil export. This means the economy is subject to the fluctuations of oil prices. As much as 95% of Venezuela's total exports were oil. This meant Venezuela did not produce much outside of oil. The president during 1999 and 2013 was Hugo Chavez. He would adopt a new constitution where he focused on social programs and strict policies around business. Oil effectively would subsidize everything. Unfortunately for Hugo Chavez's economy, it was so subjected to oil prices. So when oil prices would decline, they would run into significant budget deficits. And since they did not produce anything else, there wasn't really anything to make up the difference on these budget deficits. In order to address budget deficits when oil prices were low, the government took action by printing money to cover the budget deficits. And this created massive inflation. This extra money was chasing limited goods, driving up the prices on everything. In 2016, Venezuela was heading towards hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, defined by Philip Kagan, is an episode of an inflation rate that exceeds 50% per month. That's an equivalent to an annual inflation rate of 12,975%. That's wild. That is basically you have no idea what your money's worth. To address the inflation problem, the government implemented price controls. They started pricing goods And if you think back to the Milton Friedman quote that we had at the beginning of this video, what Venezuela is doing in this situation is putting a brick on top of the kettle while simultaneously turning up the heat. As a result of oil prices declining, inflation getting out of hand for printing money, and then putting on price controls, Venezuela was facing some major shortages of food and medicine. Businesses had no incentive to conduct business. They were under strict price controls. There was no profit to be made. There was no incentive to invest in further businesses, so there wasn't any startups that are going to address the problem. And this led to a lot of crime and poverty in Venezuela as a result of these economic policies. The United States has had its fair share of trying out price controls, and our first example that we're going to go over is from World War I. President Woodrow Wilson would tap future President Herbert Hoover to lead the Food Administration. The Food Administration was established to preserve food for the war effort. One of the first initiatives was to deliver a message to the United States to preserve food and live a simple life. It was a message. There was no strict policies put in place. It was reaching out to the American people and asking them to make the sacrifice of preserving and living a simple life, so they did not have to put food rationing or strict food policies. At Hoover's discretion, he did have the power to control food prices, food distribution, and also influence agriculture. He would eventually implement price controls on some items like wheat, meat, and sugar, as U.S. food exports would increase to ship food overseas because of World War I. Compared to our next two examples, this was a pretty mild effort in regards to price controls to influence the market and tame inflation before it got out of hand. As a result of the policies implemented by Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Hoover, this was one of the more successful stories using limited price controls and more about government influence. The initiatives to preserve food and live a simple life were fairly successful. People adhered to those messages. Unfortunately, that did not stop post-World War I inflation from happening. There was still a fair amount of inflation that happened once war was over. Another example of U.S. price controls being implemented was in World War II. The Office of Price Administration, OPA, was established under the Emergency Price Control Act on January 30th, 1942. The OPA was in charge of making sure prices didn't rise because of the government's influence. The OPA had power to place price controls and ration goods and services. The OPA effectively had this job of keeping inflation at bay with various tools to do so. The theory was that if prices were left unregulated, the government's demand for goods and services due to World War II would create widespread inflation for civilians, among other things as well. Another problem that was impacting prices and inflation was imports. Japanese ships and German U-boats would sink or confiscate ships coming to the United States to bring imports. Items such as coffee, sugar, rubber, and even canned goods were short of supply. This led to a coupon system being implemented. It was a two-price system. Basically, price controls were set in place for the cost of items, but you also had to have a coupon to buy those items since they were being rationed for the war effort. As a result of World War II and some of these economic policies, this resulted in lower quality goods. Businesses would stretch ingredients and products to produce more. For example, meat packers would fill meat with fillers such as soybeans, potatoes, or even cracker meal. Products were not as good as they used to be. Also, black markets would start to develop. What exactly is a black market? A black market is an illegal market that operates alongside a government-regulated market. This would be like the mafia. The mafia would take the opportunity to create counterfeit coupons. The coupons needed to buy essential goods. They would also hijack trucks for their goods since they could resell them at a premium, and they know they have the demand for those products since there's low supply. Bartering. This is another example where families would trade goods and services amongst each other. If someone needed coffee and the other person had sugar, they could barter between the two families and exchange those goods. Then the OPA began sanctioning all the businesses that would violate the regulations. There were up to 259,966 sanctions. They were not that big of an organization. There's no way they could tackle that. So the regulator was over-regulating, coming down on all the businesses, and it was just becoming a very inefficient system. Our last example is going to be from the early 70s during the Nixon years. And did they have an impact on the economy going into the 70s, going through the 70s, and into the 80s? In the early 70s, stagflation was a major problem. President Nixon and his economic team would make some radical moves in an attempt to address the stagflation problem. Stagflation is when you have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, while the economic growth decreases. Usually, unemployment and inflation move in opposite directions, but with stagflation, they're both moving in the negative direction, and that's a big problem. Congress did pass legislation which allowed President Nixon to place wage and price controls, but Nixon originally vowed never to use them. However, he would test out a 90-day wage freeze among many other economic efforts. This is the time when the dollar went off the gold standard. Initially, these efforts were very well received. The government was taking action to address the stagflation. In 1972 and 1973, President Nixon and his economic advisors would double down on more price controls. As a result of these economic policies, you start to see some of the Soviet Union results from their material balance planning materialize in the United States economy with the price controls in place. Ranchers would stop shipping cattle. There would be supply shortages to rising costs. And with supply shortages, consumers went to the stores and they emptied the shelves. Most of the wage and price controls were abolished by April 1974, except for natural gas and oil. Nixon would resign in August 1974 due to Watergate. The U.S. was still experiencing very high inflation during that period of time. The oil and natural gas controls would stay in place until 1979, and that created some pretty chaotic times regarding to filling up your car. Dealers sold gas on a first-come, first-served basis. Gas stations would have long lines to obtain gas, and this would also implement favoritism. If you knew somebody who had gas or had a gas station and you were friends with them, you could possibly get gas before anyone else. The wage and price controls implemented by the Nixon administration did not stop inflation. Inflation was still very hot in the 1970s. What can we reflect on using these historical examples who implemented pricing controls in order to guide the economy in the right direction? We can see that supply and demand are inevitable. You cannot get away from what people demand, and you cannot get away from what businesses or people bring to the marketplace in the form of supply. If you implement price controls, they will disrupt the market forces and alter the outcomes, but are those outcomes desirable? In the long term, it does not appear price controls will lead to desirable outcomes. It appears history indicates that when not faced with a wartime economy, we're best to let prices rise and fall with the market. Let supply and demand do their thing. Intervention only seems to make it worse. Intervention does seem tempting to cool inflation, as we've seen in several of these examples, but you're only suppressing the inflation for a short period of time, ultimately making the inflation worse for the long term. Okay, those were 3 historical examples of wage and price controls and the impact that they had on the economy once they were implemented. I hope you learned something from this video. Have a good rest of the day. Take care, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.